So costs, I've been very positive on code reviews, and that is definitely, truth be told, that is the purpose of this presentation, but there are costs and you have to understand those. You have to take those into account because there's a give and take. And in a given environment or a given solution, it may be that the costs are higher than the benefits. They outweigh the benefits of a code review. And a lot of times that may be because of the structure or the timing of your code review. So think about, while we're doing this, we go back to the code review points. Where did that go? Oh, here we go. If you go to these, like if you do your code review, you could do it on code commit before you deploy, part of a release, and as a retrospective. So there could be multiple points where you're reviewing code. You could technically actually review the same code multiple times, depending on how you do stuff. I recommend against that, but those are the kinds of things where your code review points are, those will impact how, to some extent, they may magnify or minimize some of these code review costs. Now, the first and probably the most obvious is your time spent. If you add a code review into your process, that time is going to be added into your process. There's no ifs, ands, or buts. That's like pure physics at that point. If you are going to say, we're going to do code reviews, that takes time. Therefore, that time is time that your resources could have spent doing other stuff. It may be time that you're tacking on before a release. But bottom line is there's going to be a cost of time. And depending on how you do your code reviews, it could be the cost of, for example, like say you've got a 10-person team. If all 10 people are involved in every code review, the whole team is spending that time. If you have it set up so only, let's say, 2 or 3 people are involved in a given code review, then that's going to change your costs a little bit. So you need to be aware of it, but also realize that there are process things you can do that can help adjust for those, at least to take that into account to some extent and maybe minimize the cost, or at least make it easier to swallow. Slower code deployment. And that is because typically we're going to do a code review after we've written code. So somewhere from the writing code to the deployment step, we're going to put in a code review process, and that's going to slow the deployment because at some point we're waiting for code reviews to be done and waiting to go through the code review process before to deploy. That one, if you just wait until after a deployment and do your code review, you could avoid that particular cost, but that does mean that you're going to be slower to start your next deployment cycle. So you're just sort of shifting time. It's still going to slow that down. Something that it goes back to the personal view of your code. You can end up in a situation where you're basically doing defensive programming. And this is where this goes back to sometimes the value of, this is what, sort of the cathedral versus bazaar and stuff like that. Sometimes a single person is going to be a little more comfortable with maybe, we'll say like the 80-20 rule. That they can get in, they can write their code, they see the problem, they see a solution, bada bing, bada boom, you're done. But when you open that up to review, when you have a committee or other people that are now taking a look at that, then their varying levels of risk acceptance may change what is acceptable for that code. And this would be defensive programming, is that you can get into conversations where you are trying to take into account outliers that almost never happen. And so you end up spending a lot of time trying to address a situation that almost never happens and that maybe is not that big a deal. Sometimes you look at stuff and it is, in the long run, better to allow the application to crash once in a blue moon when all you have to do is restart it, as opposed to spending hours and hours reviewing the code, adjusting it, and trying to check for a bunch of situations that may not occur, particularly if those checks are a cost to that process every time it's run. And if you think on a big scale, think of like batch data loads or exports. Probably load is more commonly something where if you're loading millions of records, and each record you want to go in and do a bunch of checks to make sure if all of the values are valid and that they're unique within the system and things like that, you may have to, but in a lot of cases you don't, not at that point anyways. So instead of the cost of all of those validations being part of the import process, you can put them somewhere else where they do not multiply because of just the number of records you're dealing with. Maybe a more simpler example. That's why when you do triggers in a database, it's often, and some similar kinds of things, or actually any real transaction, you want it to be as minimal as possible if you're locking stuff up, because you want to minimize the time that you are locking the data that you're working with. It sort of makes sense. The cost from a code review with this defensive programming is that sometimes you may overthink a solution and you end up providing, the Maserati when you could have gotten away with a Kia. It's, not to besmirch any of those products, but to just say that, sometimes we over-architect our solution, and code review can sometimes lead to that. So that's something that has to be considered as part of your environment and how you approach a code review, is to try to do it so that you don't end up in this sort of defensive programming approach to solving problems, and also that you just don't overthink your solutions. The code review itself has a cost, but preparing for a review, looking at the review, documenting it, just the mental switch to go from writing code to reviewing code, there's a cost for that. And so you want to make sure you factor that in. This is like anything else, is you want to make sure that when you're trying to get to the bottom line of, is this going to cost more than it's worth, fully thinking through what are all the things that impact the cost? What is it? What is the true cost of this? So now, all of that being said, let's talk about how do we do this and maybe build a habit. So it all comes down to attention to details. That's really what a code review is we're not going to just write code and throw it over the wall and see what happens. We're going to write code, but we're going to take write it, take a moment, take a deep breath, take a look at it, maybe make some adjustments, and then move forward. So if you want to build a habit, the first thing is you've got to start somewhere. So pick a place and set a process. This may be personal. It may be something where you could even do this with yourself. It's just a personal code review. I'm going to write code, but I'm going to go back and take a look at it before I move it forward. In an organization, it's much more, once code gets to point A, whatever that's going to be our code review checkpoint, then we're going to say there's this process that is code review, and we're going to put that into place. If you're a development shop that already exists, then you want to do that really for the new changes to code. You don't want to try to go back and code review, millions and millions of lines of code. You don't want to try to go back and code review all that stuff. You start by saying, okay, we didn't do a code review in the past, so the second best time to start it is now. And so we're going to pick a point and we're going to say, we're going to start this. In any new code, we're going to do a code review process. And that could be newly written code or even changes to code. Is that and changes to code can be far reaching. So we're going to have to talk a little bit about scope of what is included in that code review. Because it could be that you change 5 lines of code in a file that has 10,000 lines of code in it, and you don't necessarily want to go back and code review all of that. That's probably an argument to not have a file that has 10,000 lines of code in it, but that's an argument for a different day. So start by saying, all right, we're going to code review changes. Where there's code changes, we're going to do code reviews moving forward. you want to build into that process a flow to a code review that makes it easy to surface and address corrections and updates. You want to have it be something where you can go through a code review. There's a very well-defined list of changes, agreed upon changes. And then it's essentially a continuation of that process to assign those changes back to the developer. Developer can change them. You can have a sort of a shorter code review process, like a verification code review that says, yep, you made these changes. I'm good with that. Maybe do a quick look to make sure that nothing else changed as part of that. And then that flows forward, and now your code is reviewed. It will help immensely to have some sort of metric or set of metrics that you can use to measure your progress. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the tools that can provide these things that are essentially they're roughly scores on your code. So you can take a look at it and you can see over time, hopefully, how your scores get better. This may also be things that are much more bottom line driven. It may be customer acceptance scores. It may have to do with bug reports. It may have to do with system downtime, all of those things. And actually, the more, the better. The more metrics you have, the more details you have to look into what was life like, sort of a baseline of what was it before we did the code reviews and what is it after we do the code reviews. Because even though we've looked at all these pros and cons and costs and value, the bottom line metrics for your organization are going to be the best measure of how does this work for us and is it working for us? Because if it's not, it may be that it's not going to work at all. It may be how you do it, but it's like everything else. If you don't measure it, then it's going to be really hard to figure out how to change it and improve it. Once you get these things into place, there's a point where it would be useful, and you may want to be able to maybe use some tools or automated tools or something like that, just because of the time required, and go back and review your legacy code. And again, some of the tools I'm going to point you to are great ways to do this. Is you can go back and look at stuff that you wrote last year, 10 years ago, in a different language, whatever, and see how they stack up. And you may want to go through and improve that older code as well. Try to make some changes and figure a way to get that to have a better, so you have like a better baseline, essentially. And then as you're going through this, the bottom line again, you sort of get down to it and you say, all right, we're doing these things. We've made some changes. We're making corrections. We're measuring this. We've even looked at some of our legacy code. You're going to be able to improve. So as you start building that data up, take a look at those metrics. Take a look at where you can maybe make improvements. You may even be able to do sort of A/B testing, make some improvements and see if that affects the metrics in the way that you want it to. And it may be that you change your process and suddenly the metrics look worse. So maybe it's time to examine that process and say, what did we change that maybe caused this problem? Or if you see within those metrics, depending on how detailed they are, you may be able to see where there are strengths and weaknesses to what you do. And so maybe you look at how can we offset some of those weaknesses in our process. And I know these are a little vague as far as the details of the code review itself, but that really does come down to beyond bugs are sort of easy. Like everybody, it's like, if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. We've got to fix it. But when you get down to coding standards and maintainability, also requirements in certain industries, like if you're in healthcare or finance, your code review is different. There are certain things that you're going to have to take into account that you wouldn't otherwise. If I write a little app that's a to-do list app, there's a whole lot of stuff I don't have to deal with. If you write a little app that is talking to a doctor and exchanging personal health information, there's a lot of stuff that you have to do for that to be legal, to avoid fines and things like that. So your industry and your, even the way really your leadership of your IT group can greatly impact what a code review really needs to be. So those are things that you have to, unfortunately, you can have some guidelines, Again, some of the tools we're going to look at will provide you some baselines for that, but your organization itself needs to know what it needs in order to do it right. So we look at it.